What happens when the most important evidence for injustice is hidden in plain sight, buried by messy, redacted, and sometimes deliberately inaccessible data? Welcome back to another episode of Breaking Math. I'm your host, Autumn Finef, and I'm joined by my co-host, Noah John Syracusa. In today's episode, we're joined by mathematician and data scientist Chad Topaz, who has answered this question in his new book, Unlocking Justice. Chad's work sits in that messy, urgent space where data is not just sitting neatly in a spreadsheet waiting to be analyzed. Sometimes it's redacted, hidden, and printed on thousands of pages and then dumped on your front porch. In his book, Chad explores how data can reveal injustice in policing, but also how that data itself can distort, erase, and oversimplify human lives. This conversation is actually about math, but it's also about power, transparency, public records, surveillance, and even hope. Now, the question that we have underlying this conversation is, how do we use quantitative tools without losing human stories behind numbers? And also, what can ordinary people do when systems around them feel impossibly large? Chad, out of curiosity, what inspired the book?
That is a question that has several layers of response, and I will try to give you a couple of those layers. So, one is that my training is originally as an applied mathematician. So I'm someone who is trained to use mathematics to solve problems, in my case, mostly in the natural sciences. And so I spent the first part of my career working on problems in fluid physics and in chemical systems and in biology, like why are those locusts making that locust swarm, like these kinds of things. And this was, very rewarding to me. But at the same time, I had this very activist, political side of myself. And I was not engaging in that part of my life with any of the quantitative tools that I had. And just over time, through a series of experiences that we can talk more about if you want, I realized ways in which those two things could be brought together more. And so that's how I ended up being a data scientist who works on social justice issues. I think there's also a more proximate reason for me writing the book, which is that, lots of people in the United States often have a hard time here, but I think we are in an especially difficult time. We are seeing the rollback of civil rights. We are seeing the disappearance of reproductive rights. We are seeing essentially a police state. We're seeing, people murdered by ICE. We're seeing all sorts of horrible things. And I think it's very natural that people might wake up on any given day and feel really challenged by existence. And so I wanted to write a hopeful book that kind of showed people, regardless of how they feel about data and regardless of whether they think they're a numbers person, a book that gave people some hope and showed them some concrete things that they could do if they felt inclined.
I was surprised, I'll say, that the book was so personal in the sense that I was kind of expecting not a very mathy in the sense of lots of formulas, but more of a tour of the different concepts of, maybe the math behind democracy, voting, gerrymandering, things that are involved in justice. But this really was about your background. You start the book with your positioning. It really was about your experience, your upbringing, your privilege and blind spots and kind of what you discovered about the world as you're progressing through your career. And then what I thought was really compelling was it wasn't this wide tour of the whole subject from a scientific, let's stand a million miles back and look. It was, these are projects I've been involved in. These are things I've worked in. This is what I've learned. And this is what I've learned that I think you can be involved in too and how you can help. I was thinking, I don't think you use this phrase in your book, but my biggest takeaway is you call it data science, what you're doing. I think you're being more of a data detective because so many of the stories were you had to access the data. And the hard part wasn't necessarily the math and the statistical analysis. I'm sure you're used to that in your career, but it was just getting the data itself. So can you give us some examples where gaining the data or cleaning the data or just that first step was really challenging, how you got past that?
Yes, Noah, thank you for asking. I 100% agree. And it's always, I often get asked the question, like, what does it mean to do data science? Or like, what does data science mean? And like, everyone has a different answer to that question. And so for me, the whole thing that you just talked about, like, where does the data even come from? That is, for me, as you said, a huge part of the practice of data science. So to give an example, there is a chapter in this book that is about criminal sentencing in the federal judicial system. And it is well established by numerous studies, both from independent researchers and from the government itself, that there are wicked racial disparities in federal criminal sentencing. So even when you make apples to apples comparisons of individuals who have like committed similar crimes and who have similar criminal histories, Black and Hispanic Latine men receive sentences that are on average around 11 or 13% longer than those of their similarly situated white counterparts. That was from a study around the year 2019, I think. And I don't think the picture has changed much since then. So this is really well established. You could ask, given that we know these disparities exist, and given that sentences are in fact given by judges, like, who are the judges giving these sentences that end up being racially disparate? And it turns out this is extremely difficult, nearly impossible to know, because while the government puts out an annual database of criminal sentences, that data file redacts both the name of the judge who gave the sentence, and in fact, it even redacts the case number, like the case ID number that goes with that case. So in the data that the public is allowed to see, there's a row in a spreadsheet that's like, in the District of Colorado in the year 2013, in the month of April, an individual was given a prison sentence of 27 months. And like, that's essentially the information you have. And some collaborators and I was enraged by this, because according to the U.S. Constitution and the finding of a Supreme Court case called U.S. versus Richmond newspaper versus Virginia, I think was the case. There's a finding that criminal courtrooms are open to the public. So like, in principle, we're allowed to walk into courtrooms and like know who the judge is who's giving sentences. But it's a difference between the having of a right and the ability to exercise that right tangibly. Like, the government isn't telling us the thing, even though we're allowed to know the thing.
So that's a great example you gave, where the data, you had to do all these mergings and you just had all this redacted information. But there was one, I don't know if I'd call it humorous or tragic example you told in the book, where the data arrived in, let's just say, not the format you were expecting.
Oh.
What do I have
Yes,
in mind
I'm
here?
happy to say something about that. So this is a story about policing in my small town of Williamstown, Massachusetts, where I live. For reasons either the reader can discover or we can talk about if you want to, I became very interested in what my local police department was up to. So I'm fortunate to live in Massachusetts, where there's an excellent public records law. So people have often heard of like FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, which applies to like the executive branch of the federal government. But I think all states have some form of their own Public Records Act. Massachusetts has the MPRA, and it's a very good law that's kind of on the side of citizens. So I made an MPRA request to my local police department for about 2 years worth of their call logs, meaning like their records of every time someone called them about anything. And after a bunch of back and forth with them and with the state of Massachusetts, I was finally granted access to these records, but they were delivered to me in the form of printed out papers, thousands of pages of printed out papers placed in bankers' boxes, dropped on my front doorstep. And at first, I thought that this was just because the police were angry at me and were trying to be difficult. But it seems this is not the case, and that my strong suspicion of what happened is that the software that the police department has access to was not equipped to do electronic redactions, and there was some amount of appropriate redaction that needed to be done for citizens' privacy. And so they had to print out thousands of pages of paper, redact things by hand, and deliver those pages to me. Of course, we couldn't just study 5 or 10,000 pieces of paper. So we then had to scan those thousands of pieces of paper, run optical character recognition on them, the same way you might use like the recognized text feature in your favorite like PDF software. And then once we had recognized text on each scanned page, figure out like what column of a spreadsheet to put each piece of text into, essentially reconstructing the database that the police had on their computer in the first place. They just had no mechanism to export that data to us. So yes, this was to me a pretty off-the-wall story of some of the inefficiencies of how we have to access data.
And it's amazing because when I teach data science, is that we focus so much on the choice of the model. Are we doing linear regression or a nonlinear model, nearest neighbors? There's all this very theoretical stuff in math and statistics. And that's all kind of assuming you have the data in a spreadsheet. And what's amazing is here, the data was in a computer, and yet to get it, it was printed out in these boxes of paper that you were then scanned back in to get. So somehow it's this whole story of the data's life, of how it passes from hand to hand, and all these things about redactions that I, as someone who has not done the kind of work that you have, I just sort of teach the abstract cleansed version. I'm so unaware of this, right? I can talk about correlation and all these conceptual things, but I just never realized how hands-on the experience of being an on-the-grounds data scientist is. It really struck me.
I think that's really accurate. And but let's also recognize the importance of all of those models and the correlations and the linear regressions. I mean, I know you know that because you teach those things. That's important too. I teach at my institution at Williams College. I teach a course called Data for Justice, and this is like a 100-level college course that's aimed at students who have never programmed a computer before and never taken a statistics class before. And some of them approach the class thinking it's like a stats class. And I have to tell them, like, no, like most stats classes start with, here's your data. Like, these are the ways we're going to study it. And I think for a statistics class, that's appropriate. There's a lot of things you have to do in a stats class, right? I'm like, this class is like all of the things that happen before you get to here's your data, right? And so I've been trying to create more of a space to talk about some of those things. Yeah.
Now, with some of your data, you talk in the book openly about having imperfect data, and you also acknowledge that it can cause a lot of harm and argue that an inaction also carries a huge cost. So, do you want to tell us a little bit more about that and what calls that you make in practice?
Sure. I mean, it's hard. I'm someone who believes nothing that we do with data is ever all good. And so I think really the key is to be very honest and explicit about like what are the affordances of using this data and what are the harms, and you try to mitigate the harms, and you just have to like not lie. Like you have to be honest. And I think I talk about this early in the book, but one instance where this came up was some work that was a predecessor to my work on the criminal legal system. So this was actually work on diversity in the arts. And colleagues and I did a project that had to do with like assessing the gender and ethno-racial diversity of artists whose works are held in the collections of major US art museums. And we found, like, unsurprisingly, like most of these art museums have like overwhelmingly art by white men. And for reasons that I don't fully understand, but I'm certainly not complaining about, when we published this study, it like got some attention. The press picked this up, and we started getting contacted by other museums, museums that weren't in our study, and they would say things like, we would like to try to reproduce something like this. We're concerned about the diversity in our collections, but also it seems a little bit not right. Like you can't categorize like all Black artists into this like one box called Black, because like there's Black Africans in the art world. There's African Americans. There's people who have immigrated here this generation from the Caribbean. There's people who are several generations removed from that, right? There's all these different diasporas, all these different life histories that like would get grouped into this like one very oversimplified little box. And I was like, yeah, like that's true. So like inherently, when you're categorizing people, you are ignoring a lot of subtlety. Like that is the fact of it. And so we made the decision to do our study because we felt it's important to draw attention to the drastic underrepresentation of anyone who's not white men in these art museums. And we felt like we couldn't do that in a way that advanced the conversation without engaging with data. And I felt like if we sort of tied our own hands from using data, we wouldn't have been able to do anything. But at the same time, all those people in art museums who said, like, we have these concerns, like, they're not wrong. Like, all of those subtleties are ignored, you know? And I talk about this in the chapter on policing in the book, where we had to group anyone who's not white in my town of Williamstown into this box called racially minoritized, like everyone else, which in some ways is like a terrible thing to do. And so we try to be honest about that and talk about the fact, like, we did this to be able to make certain statistical statements, but also like it's lumping together all of these groups that are probably having drastically different experiences in the lives they lead and the way they interact with police here in town.
Let me amplify a point here that to me, I somehow it comes up in everything I think about and do, and I really want to get your take on it, which
Sure.
is, and this is again like a genuine dilemma that I really think about in math and data and quantification, which is, let's go back to the art study. It sounds like it's sort of well known that there was this bias in the art world, and what your work really did that was so important was to quantify it, but to put a number to it. So sometimes I feel like putting a number to something it so helps us make progress and really understand it and pin it down. But other times there's the opposite, where somehow, we overly quantify and we lose the nuance and we lose that context. So how do I know when quantifying helps and how do I know when it hurts? So honesty is something you came up, but let's drill into this a little further.
So yes, Noah, I think being honest is absolutely part of it. And something else I would say that I've taken on as a rule is to never lose individual people's stories, even when you're quantifying things. So I try to talk about this repeatedly in the book, the fact that at the end of the day, what matters is people, and talking about numbers or like handing someone a pie chart doesn't magically fix things in general. And that actually, I believe that human stories are really critically important to this conversation. So I always try to make sure that we still have those human stories as part of the picture. The other thing I would say is, like, in the case of this art museum study, I do think some people accepted that there was a diversity issue, but I don't think that everyone accepted that there was a diversity issue. So I do think the quantification did have some role to play there. I experienced something similar even before that art museum study, when a collaborator and I did a study of gender imbalance on mathematics journal editorial boards, where we looked at 13,069 editorial board positions across 435 mathematical sciences journals. And before the results of this study were out, people told me, like, Chad, you might find few gender minorities on math editorial boards, but it's just going to like reflect the low representation of those groups in the field overall. And I was like, okay, first of all, if that's true, that still isn't okay. Like, that is still a problem that needs to be addressed. But second of all, it turned out to be not true, and that in fact, representation of gender minorities on these boards was in fact substantially lower, even than the representation of those groups amongst, say, math faculty at like PhD granting departments.
I think you put it really well that at each rung of the ladder, there is this narrowing, right? So
Yes.
going from like high school to college, we have a leaky pipeline. Going from college to grad school, from grad school to faculty positions. And then I think a lot of us kind of give up at that point. Like, oh, there's not enough of different kinds of people in math faculty. And when you're looking at these editor positions, these are prestigious things. So it kind of signifies some prominence in the field, but it also is a way of influence in the field. So it really matters who has these. And you're saying, no, even there, once you take the faculty, there's still further narrowing as we keep climbing up. I think that's really a powerful way of thinking about it, that there's not one leak in the pipe. Every single juncture has leaks.
You talk at one point of the book about jails and sentencing and risk score algorithms. And everybody knows about the basic disease model where it goes from one person to the other to the other. And you have one particular chapter that's centered on Rikers Island during COVID, which is a case study in which happens to put a vulnerable population in a confined space with inadequate health structure. And you have a story about what the data reveals and about who bears the cost. So, can you walk us through this? And what does
Absolutely.
it tell us about the relationship between incarceration and race? And there's some stuff that we have not managed to fully reckon with.
Yes. Autumn, thanks for asking. So to answer this question, I have to tell you two stories in parallel. And this is, I think, a pretty good reflection of the book overall, because the way I've described the book is that it's similar to the way like you can watch a movie on Netflix and then there's also the like director's track, the commentary track. And that's how I think of this book. There's like the movie is like the way that data and data science can be used to identify injustice and promote justice. And then the director's track is about the ways that data itself can be biased or can be shaped by human forces, can be made inaccessible, all of those sorts of things. So Rikers Island is a very notorious jail. It's the jail for the city of New York. Terrible things happen there. It doesn't take a lot of Googling to find the many abuses and deaths that have happened at Rikers Island. And something interesting happened in the very early days of the COVID pandemic. So in March of 2020, then Mayor Bill de Blasio said, okay, we're very worried about the spread of COVID in Rikers Island. Spread of infectious disease in carceral facilities is a well-known thing, sadly. And so de Blasio said we need to reduce the jail population in order to like decrease the chance that this disease will spread there. And so we're going to release either people who are at high risk of contracting the disease and or like low risk of criminal reoffense. And one day, a student of mine at Williams College, Eli Miller, came to me and said, like, hey, Chad, I want to do a research project where we figure out if de Blasio did the thing that he said he was going to do. So we got to work. We got a bunch of data from New York City's open data portal. This is another place where messy data came in. There was a lot of messiness in that data that we had to clean up. In the end, the data we obtained didn't have health information about incarcerated individuals in it. The only thing that could potentially be a proxy for health was age of the incarcerated person. And this did not seem to be associated with who got released immediately following de Blasio's announcement. What did seem to be associated was the frequency with which those individuals landed at Rikers again. So let me unpack that a little bit. De Blasio said he wanted to release people at low risk of criminal reoffense. Like, my stance is it's really hard to know who reoffends. Like, to know that someone reoffends, you have to have a ground truth. Like, there's such a thing as false confessions, coerced confessions. There's such a thing as people who commit crimes and don't get caught. So we had to take a proxy for reoffense, which was like, did a person who was in Rikers and released end up there later again within some time horizon? That's what we took as a proxy for reoffense. And it seems that people who were released immediately following de Blasio's announcement were associated with a lower than expected chance of like being reincarcerated again within that time horizon. So again, this is not a proof, like this is not a causal statistical model, but basically like de Blasio said, we're going to figure out who's at low risk and let them out. And then they let a bunch of people out. We can see that in the data. And then we can see that those people ended up in Rikers again at a lower rate than usual, right? Even accounting for other things. And so like the justice angle on this was like, okay, like if you're capable of figuring out who you think is low risk and you were willing to let them out then, why aren't you doing this all the time? Like you've now proven to me that this is a thing you can do, especially given the extremely inhumane conditions at Rikers, especially given that Rikers is a jail largely holding people who are there before they've been found guilty through a trial, which in my view unjustly deprives them of their liberty. Like why are you just not doing this all the time? So that was the first thing. On the director's track, Autumn, you asked about what this means about racial equity in Rikers. And the answer is, I can't tell you. And the reason I can't tell you is because in New York City's public data, the race of incarcerated individuals is classified into three things. And I am not going to spoil for you what New York City thinks the three human races are, but I show a pie chart of it in the book because no one believes me if I don't show them the photo, and I promise you it will blow your mind. And it is a categorization that absolutely precludes us from knowing anything about racial inequity at Rikers, which is a real shame.
I mean, this is speculative, but do you feel like when you run into these issues with the data being so difficult to access and being so obfuscating, do you feel like that's deliberate, like people are trying to purposely make things hard, or do you think it's just like, we have a system from the 1950s and this is how it was set up?
Depends is my answer. So in the case of the Rikers data, we tried to do detective work. So we started sending messages through the help forum on New York's open data portal. We didn't get a reply, probably because whoever receives those emails is overworked, I'm assuming. We started calling around the city to whatever phone numbers we could find. It was very hard to reach people. The one person who got back to us, their response to us was like, wow, that's really weird. And then I said, okay, like, do you have any idea why these would be the three racial groups used? And they said, no. And I said, who would I contact to find out? And they said, I have absolutely no idea. So that's a case where I think it's probably like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. In the case of federal judges, where the judge identity is missing from data, that's absolutely a deliberate decision. So the Judicial Conference of the United States, which is sort of like the governing body of U.S. federal judges, has explicitly made the decision, like, we do not want judge identities in the data that's released.
So I'm going to shift this a little bit here. You have one specific chapter in the book, chapter 8, and it is titled Secrets the Elite Don't Want You to Know. Now, that automatically stopped me after going through the book. I'm going, all right, what is this? So for a chapter about mathematics, written by a mathematician, why you explain that title, and I need you to defend it.
Oh, certainly. So this is a book that I wrote to be non-technical and to reach like a broad public audience. I'm not writing for mathematicians at all in this book. That said, I think mathematicians would get something out of it, but I didn't write it as a book for mathematicians. The point of chapter 8 is that in a book where we are using quantitative tools, I think it's worth kind of pulling back the curtain and looking a little bit at those tools themselves and the cultures that have produced them. And so this is, again, part of the sort of director's commentary track. It's like, okay, we gotta take a critical look at mathematical tools that are underpinning a lot of what we've done. I think that could seem off-putting to a general audience who might not care about the history of mathematical tools. So I even say in that chapter, I have purposefully given this chapter a clickbaity title to make you not skip reading it. So that is my defense, but I was honest about how craven I was in choosing a clickbaity title.
And our audience here on Breaking Math, I think we can hack it. So go ahead and tell us, what are these secrets?
Okay, well, the first secret is that math is made up. And so I think I often hear people who are not mathematicians like talk about, like math is true, or like there's always a right answer or something like that. And so that it's very objective. And so in this first part of chapter 8, I'm trying to introduce readers to the idea that there are axioms, which are things that we assume and can't be proven and are chosen by humans. And then there are proofs, which are the way we decide that other mathematical statements are true. And proofs are made up of established facts, ultimately traceable back to those axioms. But of course, who decides if a proof is correct? It's also humans decide if a proof is correct. And there have been plenty of proofs in history, including in the present day, that have been contested. And there have been studies, in fact, that, for instance, take a proof, show it to several hundred mathematicians, ask them to rate it on its elegance and its clarity and other characteristics, and you get answers that are all over the place. So, like, what is a correct proof is not something that everyone automatically agrees on. And so that's what I'm trying to argue in the first part of this chapter, is that mathematics is still a thing that is constructed and enacted by humans.
Now, I agree with you, but let me play devil's advocate for a minute, which
Sure.
is, I think you're trying to raise this awareness of that there is some subjectivity in the tools and how we use them. But I could see if we go too far in that message, you're potentially feeding the conspiracy theorists to say, oh, look, I shouldn't trust math anyway, right? The axioms are just made up and proofs could be wrong. So why should I trust experts and mathematicians and data scientists? Why should I trust Chad Topaz when it's all made up and it could be wrong anyway? Isn't my intuition just as valid then? Again, I don't believe this, but I want to hear the defense.
Sure. I mean, to me, I guess I have two responses to that, Noah, and it's a very fair and important question. Like, one, I think you said something about conspiracy theorists. I'm under no illusion that I will ever convince conspiracy theorists of anything. And in fact, I'm at a point where I don't spend any time trying. And I think one of my most maddening characteristics to some people is my refusal to engage in debate with ideological opponents who have already made up their mind and are not willing to listen. So earlier in my life, I spent a lot of time debating with those people. And then at some point I was like, what am I doing? Like, rather than debating with unconvincible people, I could just be like trying to make things better. Right. So that's kind of my first reaction. The second reaction is, I think it's not wrong to take a critical look at everything. But that doesn't mean that just because you take a critical look, it's wrong, right? Like, we're having debates now. I mean, not debates, we're having misinformation about vaccines, right? There are not two sides of that story, right? That like vaccines are either safe or they're not. Like, there's overwhelming scientific evidence that vaccines are safe and effective. That is a very strong scientific consensus, right? But I think it's an important part of the conversation to say how we arrived at that consensus, right? That it's the result of a lot of work, of a lot of people who are in agreement. And like, this is what they did to come to that agreement. So to me, I guess that's what it goes back to. Like, for people who are convincible, just be honest with them. Be honest and share information. And if what you're saying is true, it can stand up to a critical look.
At the beginning, I mentioned that I feel like you're a data detective, right? Often you're trying to figure out, and like, science makes you think of the lab, and we use the word data scientist, but you're a data detective. You're trying to figure out, as you mentioned, where these sentences are coming from. If a judge is biased, what's happening in a prison? It really is like you're trying to answer these questions that one might investigate using journalistic tools, and you're using data tools instead. And as you do that, often the data is the central blockage. That's the thing that you have to really access. And
Mhm.
again, once you have the data, the statistics is not, it's not like you're using super complicated AI machine learning. Like getting the data was the hard thing, analyzing was not. So that was one thing we brought up. And the other was that your book really is a personal journey. It's not trying to say, here's the entire theory of social justice in an abstract academic way. It's saying, these are chapters of my life of things that I explored and investigated. And it was a little bit meandering. I mean that in the best way, that it really felt organic, that you didn't know what you were going to investigate and explore. Often it was a student asking an interesting question, or you seeing an unfortunate portrait in your local police department. And I love that serendipity. So my question that's kind of starting to zoom out here is, now that you've finished writing the book, now that we, or some of us, have finished reading it, what's the takeaway from looking back at this journey? Now you are this sort of social justice warrior who's using data as your main weapon, your main tool. What are the big takeaways that you've learned from your own personal journey through all these episodes?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. I think one of the most important things I learned, Noah, is to have hope. Usually, honestly, when I start out these projects, I start them, I'll just be honest with you, like in anger. Like I am furious about some injustice that I have seen. And and I think it's easy to feel like demoralized by the number of problems in the world. What I learned from not just doing work myself, but from talking to all of the many other people in this space is that small victories are possible and they matter. So one of my favorite writers is Rebecca Solnit. She wrote this book called Hope in the Dark, and her concept of hope, like it's basically hope is not like some magical silver bullet is going to come along and like solve racism. Like, yay. Like hope is acceptance of the unknown and like leaving the door open to the possibility of change and to valuing like the small victories that we make along the way. So as I proceeded through the work in this book, I tried to think along the way of like, what are all the things that would make this better? You know, it would be great if we had a law that mandated that judges' names should be attached to their criminal sentences, since that's something we're already constitutionally like entitled to. You know what? That's like a thing that you don't have to be a data scientist to understand. Anyone can understand that idea. Anyone can advocate for that idea. So at the end of each chapter, I have like a section called the path forward. That's like, here's a list of things that do not require technical expertise to do. Anyone can do these things. And then I try to recapitulate some of those in the last chapter of the book. So for me, I think that was my big takeaway is like hope is possible and there is something that we can all do.
Okay, I have a double-headed question to wrap things up for you.
Okay.
So, what are you most genuinely hopeful when you look at where data for justice work is heading? And also, what keeps you up at night when thinking about
Oh,
this?
mm,
Everything.
Everything, of
everything.
course.
Okay. So, like I said, I'm someone even though I feel the injustices of the world very deeply, despite being shielded from many of them, um, I also have a lot of hope, and some of that hope comes from my students. So um, my day job is I'm a college professor, and over the years that I've been doing this kind of work, the number of students, not just from my own institution, but honestly, sometimes I get contacted from people at other schools or graduate students or people wanting to make a career change. And they say, like, I would love to get involved in using quantitative skills to promote justice. Like, what are ways to get involved in this kind of work? And that itself is a whole long conversation we can have. But just like the uptick I have felt in the number of people who have that interest is a huge source of inspiration and hope to me. So by the way, if there's anyone listening where you think that might be your path, like call me, we'll talk. As for what keeps me up at night, there's so much going on. Um, at the intersection of data and social justice. And I have in the opening of the book like a Venn diagram where one circle is data science and the other circle is social justice. And I show them as like barely intersecting. And then I take that tiny little intersection and I label it as actually vast because there's so many different things in that intersection and many of them worry me. So one of those things is generative AI, which is, a thing that we have now, but I think a thing that brings with it many moral and ethical hazards that need to be grappled with. So that's one thing. A second thing is surveillance.
What I keep coming back to is Chad's idea that hope is not the same thing as optimism, and it's not pretending that problems are small. It's a decision to keep the door open to change. And it's to believe that small victories matter, that better data can matter, and even public pressure can change an outcome. Sometimes we have to ask the right question that can reveal an entire system that's hiding in plain sight. So until next time, stay curious of the world around you and keep asking questions. You might just make the change in the world that we need.